I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Christopher Ketcham. He's a freelance writer for Harper's, The New Republic, Vice, and many others. Today we discuss his new book, This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. It's the product of 10 years of research and travel across the public lands of the West. So first, thank you for your work in the world, and second, thank you for being on the program.
Oh, thank you.
So, tell us about the, what are public lands in the West? What are you talking about? And then second, tell us what a incredibly wonderful job the U.S. Forest Service and BLM and other agencies are doing of managing public lands in the West.
So the public lands consist of everything from the national parks to wildlife refuges managed under the auspices of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to the enormous domain managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. And, of course, there are also federal lands that aren't public that are managed by the DOD, Dugway Proving Ground and all the various testing grounds for the military-industrial complex. So my book is about my book focuses on the public lands that are the least noticed and the least protected, which is basically the 450 million acres in the American West, particularly, not in Alaska, which also has incredible range of public lands. But the 450 million acres managed in the West by the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. Now, both these agencies are tasked by Congress with something called multiple use management. And under multiple use, they're supposed to balance out things like oil and gas mining and logging and mineral extraction, hard rock mining, grazing, off-road vehicle use, mass recreation, with the broader and I think more important concerns for ecosystem health, biotic diversity, biodiversity in general, clean air, clean water, healthy soils, healthy forests, et cetera, et cetera. And there are various laws that require them to do so. For example, the Federal Lands Protection or Policy Management Act, passed in 1976, that basically states that, these lands should be managed for future generations. They should be managed for everything from scenic to archaeological to historical to a broad set of values regarding ecological health. However, the sad fact is, and this is sort of the central thesis of my book, that the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service are not, in fact, following laws such as the Federal Land Policy Management Act. They're not following the Endangered Species Act, or the Clean Air Act, or the Clean Water Act, or the National Environmental Policy Act, or the Wilderness Act, or you name it. These federal agencies that are supposed to be following federal law, that are supposed to be protecting the vast commons of the West, which is, our shared property, if you will, for want of a better way to describe it. These agencies have shirked their duty to us, the American people, and have instead degraded themselves, demeaned themselves before the various industries and industrial and capitalist interests that they're supposed to be regulating. So that's everything, as I described earlier, from timber to grazing to mining, oil and gas drilling, you name it. If there's an industry out there making money on the public lands, you can bet that the BLM and the Forest Service are out there aiding and abetting the plunder and the pillage at public expense and in violation of public trust doctrine, and often in direct violation of the very laws in place that Congress has put in place to protect these lands for future generations.
So I see a couple of directions we can go, and you can go whichever one you want. Do you want to talk about the history of the development of these public lands and then the history of the capture of the agencies, or would you rather just give us some tangible examples of, selling old growth trees for the price of a cheeseburger, or the way, I remember when I was fighting timber sales when I lived in Spokane, that they would do things like, the way they would try to hide expenses, they might amortize the cost of a road over 1,000 years. So do you want to talk about history, or do you want to give us some just crazy examples?
Well, let's do both. I mean, to understand how this regulatory capture of our land management agencies begins, right? You really have to go back to the livestock industry and the way the livestock industry evolved on the public lands. And as I describe in the book, the settlement of the West by stockmen was largely effected through force and fraud, and chicanery, lies, and mayhem and murder. So you're talking about stockmen going in, and by stockmen I'm talking about not some, salt of the earth cowboy riding the range. I'm talking about the investor class of the age, and this is the period basically starting in 1860, 65, post-Civil War. I'm talking about the investor classes from New York and Boston and Chicago and overseas in London, Edinburgh, and the like, who saw opportunity in a largely unregulated part of the world to exploit public domain for its grass in what was effectively a grass rush, a beef bonanza, and basically invested in cattle that were then managed by local ranch hands and henchmen. And this settlement of the West, for the sake of, for the benefit of cattlemen, was basically a mass theft of land from the American people. So just as railroad corporations stole land with the help of Congress, just as you had mining and timber interests committing land frauds to snatch up land that was heavy with ore or had valuable timber on it. So too, you had the livestock industry, as I said, engaging in force and fraud for their economic interests. So what happens? 1865 through 1900, you've got basically a bonanza on the lands, beef bonanza. But the land is very quickly degraded because of overgrazing. And so into this mix comes the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. And the Taylor Grazing Act establishes something called the U.S. Grazing Service. The U.S. Grazing Service is put in place to, quote unquote, stop the deterioration of the public lands, of the grazing lands. But what happens with the Grazing Service? Well, the very stockmen and stock interests that are responsible or were responsible for the degradation of the land capture the agency, this nascent federal agency, the U.S. Grazing Service, so that the cattle stay out on the land and the deterioration doesn't stop. But now there's a management regime under federal leadership for the cattlemen to continue pillaging the public domain. Fast forward to 1946, the Grazing Service is merged with the U.S. Land Office. And the U.S. Land Office, prior to that, had been responsible for mass privatization of the public domain through the Homestead Act.
Which, by the way, was every bit as corrupt as all this other stuff we're talking about. But
well, it was the Homestead Act that was the prime target of violation by all these various corporate and individual interests, cattle baron interests, mining, timber tycoons and the like. Yeah, they would exploit the loopholes in the Homestead Act, and I describe this in detail in my book, in order to lay claim to vast swaths of land that, of course, were fraudulently obtained in violation of the Homestead Act. Basically you have the creation of the Bureau of Land Management in 1946 through the merger of the General Land Office and the Grazing Service. And again, you have a continuation of the same regulatory capture that occurred with the Grazing Service. The cattlemen basically dominate the BLM to the point that the BLM is staffed with cattlemen who are assuredly watching over the interests of their brethren in the public lands livestock industry. Now, fast forward to present day. None of this has changed. The BLM is still a captured agency. The old joke is that the BLM is actually the Bureau of Livestock and Mining. And, of course, with the advent of fracking in the past 15, 20 years, the BLM has become, as I described in the book, a slavering prostitute to energy interests. So you have all across the public domain this history, this profoundly corrupt history that is very much germane today to what happens on that land and how it's mismanaged, how the land is abused and degraded and made depauperate and ecologically simplified. Too many cattle, too much mining, too much drilling, too many roads, too much traffic, too much pollution, et cetera, et cetera.
So let's give some tangible examples of the either the corruption or the absurdity. I'm thinking of how cheap it is to run cattle or sheep on public lands, we can come up with a boatload of examples. So let's just do let's sort of give some actual examples to make clear the level of absurdity.
Right. Well, let me tell you a story that was related to me by a veteran BLM biologist named Roger Rosentreter. And he tells me a story about how a couple of years back, Department of Interior lawyers were meeting with BLM district managers. And the lawyers are complaining to the district managers because the BLM is broken up into – the BLM is very much a state-managed, state-centric kind of agency. Each state has various districts, and in each of those districts you have a manager. And often those districts are enormous, encompassing 10 million acres of land. So these lawyers are meeting with the BLM managers. And the lawyers are complaining, and they're saying, we keep losing lawsuits filed by green groups and environmental activists because you guys are doing things that are indefensible. You're not following federal law. And so when these groups sue, we have no recourse but to settle with them, or judges have no recourse when they see how blatant and flagrant the violations of the laws are. And the BLM managers scoffed as if they were talking with, a group of naifs who had no idea what the real political landscape was in the West. And the BLM manager said, well, we know what the law is, but you don't pay us enough to follow the law. If I followed every environmental law and really regulated the land for environmental health and ecological health, I'd have every state legislator, every congressman and governor, and every stock baron and mining tycoon, who the state reps and the congressmen answer to. I'd have them gunning for my job, and they would be out to destroy me. So the BLM managers went on chastising the innocent, even stupid DOI lawyers, and said, we wait for the enviro groups to sue us because as we told you, we know we're violating the law. But if the enviro groups force us to do something, then we can survive in our jobs and say, hey, the enviro groups are forcing our hand on these issues. We're not doing it. So there you see an example of how this corruption works. There is incredible pressure not to regulate. And that pressure comes down on the state level, comes down on in Congress, it comes down in the governor's offices, and it is heavily felt in the field, in these field offices and district offices of both the BLM and the Forest Service. In the case of the Forest Service, let me see if I can find this excellent quote from my book that describes exactly how the Forest Service regards the land. Just give me a moment. Yeah, this is Ron. So I interviewed a guy named Ron Mitchell, who of the Idaho Sporting Congress, and he was telling me that the Forest Service lies and lies. They corrupt their environmental impact statements to support logging projects, always. They'll tell you the bathroom's down on the left. Well, it's on the right. You can't trust a thing they say. I interviewed a Forest Service guy named Al Espinoza, who worked as a fisheries biologist in Idaho for 19 years. And here's what he told me. The corruption is prevalent in the leadership, especially at the higher levels. And by the leadership, he's talking about the Forest Service. The Forest Service operates on a reward system based on, quote, getting the cut out, timber harvest. Promotions are directed to those that excel at meeting the objective. The agency has a very tight and efficient network consisting of industry officials, lobbyists, and local and national politicians. Individuals and groups that get in the way of the system and network are vilified. Indeed. So both of the BLM and the Forest Service, if you stand up to do the right thing, which is to protect the land under those laws that Congress has passed, to do so, you will be vilified. You will be excoriated. You will be punished. You will be demoted. You might even lose your job. So, how are these land managers incentivized? Even if they have an ecological conscience, they are incentivized to be quiet and to be submissive and to not try to change the system. And this is a theme that runs throughout my entire book, where again and again and again I meet up with people who say, hey, I want to do the right thing, but I can't. Aside from quitting and saying to hell with this and going public as a whistleblower, but that takes incredible courage. It also takes some financial security. A lot of people don't have that. They've got families and children and mortgages and, electricity bills to pay and et cetera, like all of us. So they're kind of trapped.
When I lived in Spokane and was working with groups that were trying to stop illegal timber sales, the organization would routinely receive, this is back pre-cell phone days, back in the 90s, and would routinely receive phone calls from public payphones. People basically, it was like spy movies. People would call up and they're whispering into the phone saying, so I'm on my lunch hour and I can't tell you my name. I can't tell you who I am, but I can tell you on this particular timber sale, look on pages 47, 53, and 114 because you will see some pretty nasty stuff. And, and it was exactly what you're saying. These people couldn't come out. They had to destroy the public lands in their job, but they had a conscience and they would, like one person called up and provided, this ended up being a pretty big scandal, provided evidence that a series of national forests were, keeping double books. So there was one book that they kept for the public on how much land had been cut, and then one that they really kept for themselves to make sure they didn't get confused on how much land had been cut.
Wow. So that one set of books was presented to the public, and the other was kept as an actual ledger of the damage done? Yeah. I see. It's tricky.
Yeah. So, and I guess let's back up a step and just pretend you're talking to somebody in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, or Atlanta, Georgia, who may have this idea that if lands are public, that means they're protected. I know this is kind of late in the interview to do this, but can you go back and sort of plug that little ideological hole and let people know the scope and size? Oh, and then while you're at it, we talk about ranchers, and sometimes they're even called welfare ranchers, but there's still this notion that it's a cowboy on the range. And I don't remember the numbers, I don't remember the names, but I'm pretty sure that Anheuser-Busch is one of the top 10 cattle holders on public lands. It's not Joe Cowboy with his handlebar mustache. This is, as you said earlier, this was the robber barons, and now it is. So can you step back for a second and give us a sense of the scope of the plunder of these Western lands, just to make sure we know the Western lands are not, the public lands are not protected, just to make it 100% clear.
Right. Okay, to someone who is unfamiliar with the public land system, right, the whole idea that they are under management by the Forest Service, which is a branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or under management by the Bureau of Land Management, which is a branch of the U.S. Department of the Interior. All those monikers and those acronyms sound very official, as if they're, as if they must be doing the right thing.
Like wildlife refuge. That's a refuge for wildlife. That's the point, right?
That's the point, but it doesn't work out that way. The point is, as I said earlier, that these agencies are exemplars of of what political economists call regulatory capture, in which they have been captured by the very interests that they're supposed to be regulating. And now this is commonplace in the United States, in our system. The FCC is largely captured by telecom interests. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is largely captured by Wall Street. Ditto the Department of the Treasury, Wall Street, hedge funds, bankers, et cetera. Or you have the incredible revolving door at the Department of Energy and the Department of DOD with the private military industrial complex. So it's not as if this is some anomalous set of affairs. It's just that I think the public oftentimes sees, for example, the Forest Service and thinks of Smokey Bear, or thinks of Lassie out there running around with a park ranger stopping, or forest rangers, stopping forest fires or whatever it might be, saving some lost lad out there in the woods in a canyon. So the public has a generally favorable view of the land management agencies, and I think that clouds their perception of how rotten these agencies actually are. Now, that's not to say, as we were discussing earlier, there are a lot of good people employed in the agencies, but the bureaucratic wind that blows in those agencies is always towards more extraction, more deference to industry, more exploitation of quote-unquote resources, you know. And even the word resources, as used among these agencies, reduces the public lands to just that, a series of objects to be used in the most utilitarian manner for the benefit of the one true godlike species, Homo sapiens, right? In which the whole world is just a bunch of resources. So the public, however, doesn't think about that stuff, doesn't really know about it, especially people living, say, in the East, in Richmond, Virginia, or in Atlanta, Georgia, or in New York City, where I'm from. So, and part of the purpose of my book is to lift the veil for the broad public on these problems in our in federal land management agencies. Now, to your question about grazing on the public lands and who these grazers actually are, what are the real interests that overstock and overgraze and denude the grasslands of the American West? Well, right, they're not mom and pop ranchers for the most part. I have the section in my book here. So the 20 largest permit holders for leases of public lands for grazing. So basically the system, just as an aside, the system works like this. Basically, if you have cattle, you want to run them on the public lands, you want to graze the grass on the public lands, you need to get a permit from either the BLM or the Forest Service. And that permit, by the way, is highly subsidized, far cheaper than a similar per acre or per cattle unit cost would be on private land, right? So something like to graze a cow-calf pair, right, on private land in the American West is something like $20 for the month, right? On public lands, it's something like $1.50, between $1.35 and $1.50. It changes every year, but it's roughly $1.35 to $1.50, i.e., it's heavily subsidized. It's way below market value. So you have these permit holders, or rather you have these cattle interests that go out, they get a permit from the BLM and the Forest Service, then they run their cattle on the land. So who are they? Well, as I was starting to say a moment ago, the 20 largest permit holders, right, include the J.R. Simplot Company. And J.R. Simplot is a he's a billionaire. This is the company. I mean, he's dead now, but his company provides something like half of all the potatoes that are sold at McDonald's as French fries, right? You have Ted Turner, the media baron. You have the Hilton Hotels chain people. You've got the Walton family of Walmart. You've got Anheuser-Busch, the world's largest producer of bad beer, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, Agri-Beef Company, the Barrick Gold Corporation, which is an $8.5 billion Canadian mining company. These are the largest public land ranchers, quote unquote, on the public domain, and they are heavily subsidized. And now, meanwhile, you also have below them, in terms of the hierarchy, you got a lot of just rich hobbyists, just rich guys who want to get into cattle ranching because it's romantic. And they, too, are out there running their cattle on the public domain, heavily subsidized, at incredible cost to the land. Livestock ranching, in terms of, your question earlier was what is the extent of the destruction that's ongoing on the public domain? Well, there's 450 million acres in the West, as I noted earlier, managed by the Forest Service and the BLM, right? Something like 250 million acres of that, maybe a little bit more, is grazed. And when I say grazed, what I'm really saying is it is, in many places, ecologically devastated. In that, when you set out cows in large numbers into arid country, such as most of the American West, they have a terrible effect on soil, on water, on water quality, in that they're defecating and churning up mud and churning up sediments. They destroy native plants. And meanwhile, there is a federal agency dedicated to the destruction, to the mass destruction of predators and pests, right, who are said to threaten the public lands livestock industry. And this is a branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture called Wildlife Services. Wildlife Services every year slaughters millions of animals across the United States. And much of their work is done to serve one industry, the livestock industry. So yes, to the people of Richmond, Virginia, and Atlanta, Georgia, I would say just call your congressman and demand why your land is not being protected for your interests.
When you were talking about celebrity landowners, I was remembering, I believe Sam Donaldson, the old, he's dead now, the newscaster, he was fabulously wealthy, and he had a big ranch in, I believe it was New Mexico. And the reason I knew about this is because he had this big hobby ranch, he was very much an advocate for killing wolves.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you want to talk just a little bit about, you've talked about Wildlife Services, which is just, you couldn't ask for a better Orwellian name.
Right. Yeah, we'll service your wildlife, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about, wolves? I know that the other day, I don't know if this was a state or federal, thing. A couple grizzly bears got killed endangered species, got killed. Humanely euthanized, in Montana because they'd killed a couple chickens. It just, wait. Actually, there's a different question I want to ask first, which is, so if I have a couple cows and I want to run them up in the national forest or on BLM land, can I just walk out and say, hey, can I have a permit? Or is that actually, I'm a member of the public. Why can't I graze my cows there?
You have to have, the Taylor Grazing Act basically establishes that you have to have some a base property adjacent to public lands in order to graze on public lands. So that's why, you got rich guys buying up ranches on private land, but that private land often comes with so-called grazing privileges, or grazing rights, as they like to call it. It's a privilege, not a right, obviously. So no, you can't just go up and run cattle on the public land without having some base property under the, stipulated under that 1934 law.
And then in addition, doesn't that, the way you talk about it, the point I'm really getting at is, aren't these, privileges, aren't these permits really essentially heritable? So basically you end up with more or less literal barons who can control.
Yeah, as long as the property is handed down. Sorry. Yeah, as long as the property is handed down, absolutely. Yes, it becomes a heritable, becomes a form of property, if you will. So these leases, which are privileges, which should be revocable, rarely are, are, yes, become a form of property. And the ranching livestock industry likes to refer to it as a property right when it is no such thing.
Just to be clear, this is they are inheriting and they are holding as property in their perspective the right in their perspective to access public lands. This is not their land, but they have a right, according to them, to do this basically into perpetuity at an incredibly cheap cost. I mean, the whole thing just seems nuts to me.
Well, look, we all have the right to access public lands. It's a question of what we do on the public lands. If our access involves a exploitation of the land to the extent that it is detrimental to all the other values that we're supposed to be protecting on the public land, then it's a problem. If you have a few people just walking out in the public lands, maybe picking a flower or two, big deal. That's not a problem. I mean, of course, that point relates to, I think another threat that now looms on the horizon for public lands, which is mass industrial recreation. In the same way that if you have too many cows on the land, if you have too many people on the land, you're going to scare off the wildlife, you're going to have more traffic, and that also wrecks ecosystems. You're going to have more activity, and that activity can often be detrimental to native flora and fauna. So it's a matter of scale, right? I could see a system in which you have a couple of cows on the public land, no big deal. A couple of cows, right? Maybe for subsistence farming, not for market production, but for just grow a couple of cows in the public lands. Not a problem. But if you have them on the scale that you have them, millions upon millions of cows going out in fragile ecosystems, well, then you have suffering, and it's the land that suffers. And then my view is ecocentric, biocentric. I really think that Homo sapiens has dominated to such an extent our planet that it's shameful and dishonorable, and that at this point, if we really are to be an enlightened bunch and move beyond our barbaric views of our relationship with nature, we have to show some restraint and humility and say, hey, there are places where we shall not dominate, and we shall make a conscious decision to not dominate those places.
So tomorrow, okay, we have about 10 minutes left. And tomorrow, Donald Trump does one good thing, and he appoints you to be the head of both the BLM and the Forest Service. And this is I know that's not.
But let's just stick with the BLM because they're two different agencies.
Yeah,
one is USDA, one is DOI.
Oh, I know that wouldn't work. But I was gonna try to get you to stop timber extraction at the same time.
Okay.
Okay, but choose one. So he calls you and he says, Chris, you get to be in charge of either the BLM or the Forest Service, and you're not going to get fired no matter what political pressure there is. So take it. So if they put you in charge of, first choose Forest Service or BLM. Second, tell me what your first 200 days in office would be. What would you do?
All right. So I'm going to take the BLM because the domain is much larger, and I think in terms of ecosystem, the vastness of the ecosystems represented by the BLM is in fact more ecologically important. Though the Forest Service are extremely important, the forest lands, the national forests are extremely important. I'm not going to. Bears?
No, just a crazy cat.
Okay. Okay, I'm in the BLM. First off, kick off all the cows. Gone. No more cattle grazing. That's it. Then I would start dismantling roads. So just have a big public works project to destroy roads. So de-roading all across public lands. To create the kind of scale of wilderness that E.O. Wilson talks about when he talks about setting aside half of Earth as a biological reserve. And then I would start dismantling, I would let trails basically be overgrown. I'd start cutting down signage for hikers and bikers. And my policy would be, hey, if you want to go on the public lands, you are on your own, buddy. And no more driving. You can go by horseback. You can walk. No motorized vehicles. I make it all wilderness, by the way, under the 1964 Wilderness Act. So no more motorized transport. No more roads. We're giving it over to the wild things. And if we want to go into those places and join the wild things, we can, but we have to do it on their terms. Or mostly on their terms. You know, you can bring a knife. Maybe a gun or two if you want to go hunting and hunt for your own meat. So that's my first 3 days. I don't know what happens in the other 197, man. Probably get assassinated or something. But it's, you know, there's at the end of my book, I advocate exactly such a program, but I also am clear with the reader that it is politically impossible. It will never happen, short of some sort of uprising on the part of citizens, of us, the common owners of the land, who say, hey, we want to change how this land is managed.
You know, so, I live in Crescent City, California, and there is a local national forest that is actually managed pretty well. And the reason that particular forest happens to be managed pretty well is that until very recently, they didn't have a commercial timber sale program. And they recently instituted it. It's very, very small. So what this means, like I got a good friend who works as a wildlife biologist for it, and for the past 20 years, past 15 years, however long, one of his primary jobs has been is taking out roads from mining from 120 years ago. So it's actually kind of cool. This is just an example of what you're talking about how, and as I said, over the last 10 years, they've started to institute a timber sale program, and that's horrifying, and it's also will be interesting over the next 20 years to see how that affects, on a sort of sociological experiment, how that will, I think, destroy the goodness of this particular Forest Service, this particular national forest. It's just, my point is.
Well, like I said, there are good people in these agencies, but the agencies are subservient to capitalist interests.
So
Ergo, to protect the lands, we got to go against capitalism, and that's really the fight. And by the way, I forgot. On my fourth day in office as like tyrant of the BLM, I would also end our federal mining program. The gas drilling, the oil drilling, the fracking. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare that's ongoing, man. And it's a climate bomb, too.
And, you know, another thing that's not often enough mentioned, and this is a trivial thing compared to mining and grazing and logging, but ski resorts are on federal land, too.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of blew me away when I learned that quite a while ago, that, like, all those big ski resorts, those are my lands.
Mm-hmm. Ski resorts are very destructive of habitat. And the lights, the activity, the noise basically create a perimeter around them that chases off wildlife. So, yeah. I don't ski, so.
Yeah, even though I grew up in Colorado, I don't either. So,
don't either.
So we need to take on capitalism. So I know that this is a fairly weak thing to end on, but, well, I'm going to give you two endings. One of them is, what right now do you want people to do? Somebody living in New York City, what are they supposed to do about this? And then second, give us your best hope for the future of public lands through a successful revolution? Or go somewhere else if you'd rather.
What can people do right now, practically, within the confines and constraints of the system? Well, call your congressperson. Call your congressperson and complain and complain and complain and write letters and call them and email them and bug them as much as possible. There you go. Step one. In terms of how the lands would be changed if we have a quote-unquote revolution, that is, we somehow put the capitalism in the cage where it belongs. I don't know. I think it would look a lot like what I described in my 4 days in office at the BLM. I mean, just a liberation of the land from exploitation to serve the one species and to serve profit and economic growth. The likelihood of that happening, though, man, I mean, let's be realistic. We're kind of trapped in this system. And so unless collectively we make a decision to change it, it's not going to change. So.
And what people can do also, especially in the West, is they can fight individual timber sales, they can fight timber sale plans, they can fight planning documents at every step of the way.
That's right. That's right. Or participate in NEPA. You know, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, mandates public participation in all federal land management decision making. It's a broad mandate for you, the American citizen, to participate in this process and to object to those proposals and decisions that are ecologically, environmentally, morally objectionable. And so there's a wide window there through which to fire your shotgun at the system. Now, there's also, you know, and I write about this in the final chapter of my book, there's also individual acts of sabotage. I'm not against that. Of property damage. You know, maybe you've been through the NEPA process and you see road graders and logging equipment by the side of the road, and you know that NEPA was in fact violated and that this logging that's ongoing under the imprimatur of legitimacy provided by a corrupted NEPA process is going to continue. Well, maybe sabotage those bulldozers, sabotage the logging equipment. Why not? There's no harm in that. All it is an inanimate object. Inanimate objects, by the way, serving economic interests that are killing living things for money. So let's put that in perspective. You know, they call eco-saboteurs extremists. They're not extremists. The extremists are the ones who kill living things for profit. Those are the extremists. So once we get that clear, you know, then the perspective on eco-sabotage changes a bit, in my opinion. And, you know, sabotage can be as small as, for example, I was wandering through a national forest and I saw these flagging all around the forest for a timber sale. I just cut down the ribbons, pulled out my Leatherman, cut, snip, snip, snip. Oh, well, they're going to have to retag the whole goddamn forest. Good. Then I'll come back when they retag it and cut them down again.
Was it Ed Abbey or Dave Foreman who said that one should always, underline always, remove survey stakes?
Always. It was Abbey first and then Foreman.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Always remove survey stakes. Road survey stakes? Absolutely. Roads are without roads pierced into previously unroaded places, you do not have all the cascading devastation from all the other forces that depend on roads. So, yeah, roading is one of the first things that we should stop on our public lands.
Well,
and I end my book with that very point about roading. Roads. Let's take them out.
And, you know, we're out of time now, and I just want to say to listeners the same thing that I said to you when I read your excellent book, which, by the way, is called This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West, that I don't even remember my exact language that I said to you when I read the book, but it was something along the lines of finally a successor to Ed Abbey. And I just want to reiterate that here, that Ed Abbey would be smiling from wherever he happens to be out in the desert, and Dave Foreman is still alive, and I'm sure is smiling too. So first off, thank you for your work in the world. Second, thank you for being on the program. Third, I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Christopher Ketcham. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.